Hi, nice to meet you all. I would like to thank the organizers for this great conference and for encouraging MA students to take part in the conference. I think that it's a great privilege to receive comments from more experienced scholars than you. In this lecture, I intend to address the question of home and habitation in Levinas, as presented both in totality and infinity, and otherwise than being. This question is part of a broader subject I am concerned with, which is how we can philosophically think about migration via Levinas. However, unlike Alessandra, who spoke before me, my perspective is not primarily political, but rather a metaphysical one. I am concerned with the question: what kind of subject an immigrant is? Now, immigration can be understood in two main ways. One is a concrete move from one country to another for various reasons, and the other is migration as a mindset, that is to say, a part of the human condition, which refers to a personal transformation. Home is essential to the question of immigration, as it is precisely what is at stake while migrating. An immigrant is one who leaves one home in favor of another. One, of course, cannot talk about immigration and hospitality without recalling Abraham, an immigrant for whom hospitality is a central option, and thereby he is a hero to whom I refer in my work, and moreover, whom I see as a paradigm of the connection between immigration and hospitality. However, my broader question, which I will address only briefly in today's lecture, is how immigration would appear from a phenomenological perspective. What I will mainly focus on today is the question of home. What is home then? In Totality and Infinity, Levinas writes, habitation can be interpreted as the utilization of an implement among implements. In this case, the home would serve for habitation as the hammer for the driving in of a nail, or the pen for writing. For it does indeed belong to the gear consisting of things necessary for the life of man. It serves to shelter him from the inclemencies of the weather, to hide him from enemies or the importunate. And yet, within the system of finalities in which human life maintains itself, the home occupies a privileged place. The privileged role of the home does not consist in being the end of human activity, but in being its condition, and in this sense, its commencement. End of quote. Home is therefore not simply a tool for the utilization of man, as the relationship between the hammer and the nail, nor is it the ultimate goal of human activity. Rather, the home is the condition of human activity. The home is what enables it in the first place. Home is what we carry with us even when we are not physically at home. For instance, even an Israeli MA student who travels to Rome to attend a philosophical conference still carries his home with him in a sense. Hence, the home also ultimately enables the possibility of radically opening towards the other via hospitality. However, according to Levinas, home is not a primal thing, as it is conditioned by something else, or more precisely, by somebody else. Levinas says, quote, "The interiority of recollection is a solitude in a world already human. Recollection refers to a welcome. The other, whose presence is discreetly an absence, with which is accomplished the primary hospitable welcome which describes the field of intimacy, is the woman. The woman is the condition for recollection, the interiority of the home and inhabitation." End of quote. How should one then understand the precondition of the home, that is, woman? Is what Levinas talks about is simply the feminine aspect of life, which does not depend on one's biological sex? And in this sense, we could say that in a close friendship, each of the partners offer one to another a feminine aspect of life, a comforting aspect, which is the condition of home. Or, rather, does one have to be concretely married in order to have a welcoming home? We may suggest that Levinas is quite ambiguous regarding this topic. In the chapter on dwelling in totality and infinity, Levinas says that the empirical absence of the human being of feminine sex in dwelling nowise affects the dimension of femininity, which remains open there as the very welcome of the dwelling. End of quote. This description refers to the first sense of femininity, namely the feminine aspect of life, independent of the presence of a concrete woman or spouse. However, in Judaism and the Feminine, a text that was published a year earlier and appeared in Difficult Freedom, the tone which arises is that just like when Levinas mentions home, he refers to a concrete one, same is in the case of the feminine. It is not the case of the feminine aspect of life here, but rather of having a relationship with a concrete woman. And so Levinas writes, quote, "For the inevitable uprooting of thought, which dominates the world, to return to the peace and ease of being at home, the strange flow of gentleness must enter into the geometry of infinite and cold space. Its name is woman. The conjugal bond is therefore simultaneously a social bond and a moment of self-consciousness, the way in which a being identifies and rediscovers itself." End of quote. Therefore, it seems that there is an ambiguity regarding whether it is the concrete woman or the feminine in general that enables home in the first place. Because of this ambiguity, one gets the impression that the feminine in Levinas is taken for granted, and likewise, home is taken for granted, as if it is unquestionable. Even if one was displaced, or, on the contrary, if one is homeless, for Levinas one still has a home. That brings me to the impression that in early Levinas, home is too stable, incapable of being put under a question, and therefore does not allow us to think about liminal situations in which one's home is undergoing changes of any kind. And although for Levinas home is a part of what he calls the economical realm of life, that is to say, the realm of the same, home is still the condition of the possibility of the radical opening upon the other. Hence, one should not underestimate its importance in our day-to-day life. I think that what is so unique in Levinas's description of home is precisely the connection to day-to-day life. That is, a possibility of opening towards the profound alterity of the other, towards transcendence, from within day-to-day life. It is Levinas's latter writings, and especially Otherwise Than Being, in which it seems to me that home is never stable, as the title of my lecture suggests. In Totality and Infinity, the home is the subject. In Otherwise Than Being, the subject's place, which is both metaphorical and literal, is different. Levinas's attempt in this book is to try to listen to the other while respecting his otherness. That is, to listen to the other, to listen to the other, that is, to listen to what Levinas calls the saying, which includes radical otherness, but also betrays itself, as Levinas says, in the said, that is, the communication which thematizes the unique call for the other, which is also the infinity. Levinas aspires to try to reduce that self-betrayal of the saying in order to be able to hear some of the saying without thematizing it. Now back to our question, the question of home, which is the subject. What kind of subject, according to Levinas, is required to fulfill his attempt in totality and infinity? Which type of home does such a philosophical aspiration offer to us? Levinas says, quote, "The subject in saying approaches a neighbor in expressing itself, in being expelled, in the literal sense of the term, out of any locus, no longer dwelling, not stamping any ground. Saying uncovers, beyond nudity, what dissimulation there may be under the exposedness of a skin laid bare." End of quote. Instead of home, we find here a window at best, through which one has the potential to approach the other by exposing oneself, by being vulnerable. But in my opinion, such a description of home, or more precisely, of what is left of home, does not allow us to think about immigrants' home. the habitation that Levinas offers in his latter writings is never stable, since it is conditioned by the other, that is, by being exposed to and traumatized by the other. And, as we know, what an immigrant needs during the concrete difficulties he is facing is some stability that a comforting home can offer. However, Levinas's description of the subject in Otherwise Than Being also reveals a potential for addressing the question of immigration. Whereas home in totality and infinity offers the immigrant some comfort, I'm not sure this is the case in Otherwise Than Being. If dwelling is not possible in the strong sense of dwelling, such as the one that was presented in Totality and Infinity, perhaps the change that the immigrant undergoes is not simply a unique occurrence in life. Perhaps this impossibility reveals something more profound, which can be relevant to any subject, to any human being in general, and shows us something about the human condition. What I'm suggesting is not to completely erase the home, but rather to better understand what we are talking about when we discuss home. It seems that the immigrant is someone we should dwell on. One apparent reason is that immigration is a situation that is highly relevant today and occurs frequently in our world in 2025. Another reason, which in my opinion is no less relevant, is that the immigrant is an extreme case of being at home. It is precisely the immigrant that can offer us new perspectives on Otherwise Than Being 50 years after the book's publication. Thank you for listening, and I would love to hear your comments.